My in-laws called me a gold digger and banned me from family events, so I let them find out I make more than their son. I still remember the first time I visited the Miller family home. The sprawling colonial with its manicured lawn and gleaming bay windows seemed to whisper, "You don't belong here." Daniel squeezed my hand as we walked up the steps, his smile reassuring but his eyes betraying a hint of anxiety. "They'll love you," he promised. "Just be yourself." Little did I know that myself was precisely what the Millers would find so objectionable. From the moment I married Daniel, his parents treated me like a suspicious outsider who had somehow infiltrated their precious family fortress. Margaret Miller, with her perfectly coiffed silver hair and permanent look of mild disappointment, greeted me that first day with an embrace that felt more like an assessment. Her husband Richard, a retired banking executive who still dressed like he was heading to a board meeting on Sundays, shook my hand with the enthusiasm of someone touching a damp washcloth. "So, this is the woman who managed to catch our Daniel," Margaret had said, her smile tight, eyes appraising me from head to toe. "You must feel like you've won the lottery." That comment, seemingly innocent but loaded with implication, was just the first drop in what would become a steady downpour of subtle digs and backhanded compliments that defined my relationship with the Millers. No matter how kind I was, how supportive, how successful in my own right, I was always just the wife who got lucky. 7 years into our marriage, not much had changed. The Millers had mastered the art of making me feel simultaneously invisible and under a microscope. "Andrea, darling, I'm sure you won't mind if we steal Daniel away for another family business dinner?" Margaret would say, not actually phrasing it as a question. "It's all so boring, stocks and investments and expansion plans. You'd be absolutely miserable." I'd smile and nod, pretending that being excluded for the 12th time that year didn't sting. Daniel would shoot me an apologetic look, promise to be home early, then disappear for hours with his parents and sometimes his older sister Elise, who had inherited both the family's business acumen and their thinly veiled condescension. The Millers idolized Daniel. In their eyes, he was the golden boy who had built a thriving technology company from nothing but raw talent and determination. His success was confirmation of their superior parenting, their excellent genes, their family's destiny for greatness. At family gatherings, they'd parade him around like a show pony, introducing him to their friends as Daniel Miller, founder and CEO of Monarch Systems, their voices swelling with pride. Meanwhile, I was relegated to the background, a decorative accessory to Daniel's narrative of success. "And this is Andrea, Daniel's wife," they'd add as an afterthought, never mentioning my own career or accomplishments. Sometimes they'd embellish with, "She used to work in marketing before Daniel's business took off," as if I'd retired to a life of leisure rather than continuing to build my own professional identity. The worst incident came at the Millers' 30th anniversary celebration. It was an elaborate garden party with champagne fountains and a string quartet. I was standing near the rose trellis, making polite conversation with one of Richard's golf buddies, when I overheard Margaret talking to her sister. "Daniel's been so generous with Andrea," she was saying, her voice carrying just enough for me to hear. "That's the thing about marrying up. Suddenly you're enjoying a lifestyle you never could have achieved on your own." Her sister had laughed and replied, "Well, she must have seen dollar signs when she met him." Instead of defending me, Margaret had simply chuckled and said, "We all make our choices, don't we?" I laughed it off when Daniel asked why I'd gone quiet that evening. But I never forgot it. The words burrowed deep, festering beneath the surface of every subsequent interaction. The irony of it all was that Daniel was nothing like his parents. He was kind, unpretentious, and genuinely supportive of my career. But he was also oblivious to the subtle warfare being waged beneath polite smiles and crystalline laughter. When I tried to point out his mother's backhanded compliments or his father's dismissive attitudes, he'd look confused. "Mom's just old-fashioned," he'd say. "And Dad treats everyone that way. It's not personal." But it was personal. Very personal. Last Christmas, when I wasn't invited to the annual Miller family ski trip to Aspen, its tradition, Andrea, just immediate family, I started to wonder if Daniel's blindness to his parents' behavior was willful. Was it easier for him to pretend everything was fine than to confront the people who had placed him on a pedestal his entire life? I found myself retreating, building walls to protect myself from the constant reminders that I was an outsider. I stopped suggesting weekend visits to the Miller estate. I developed convenient work emergencies when family dinners arose. I crafted a careful persona for the unavoidable holiday gatherings, pleasant but reserved, engaged but not vulnerable. Through it all, Daniel remained caught in the middle, a man torn between the family that raised him and the woman he chose to spend his life with. He'd try to bridge the gap with awkward jokes and changes of subject whenever tensions rose. He'd bring me expensive gifts after particularly exclusionary family events, as if silver bracelets and designer handbags could compensate for the steady erosion of my dignity. "They'll come around," he kept promising. "They just need time." But after 7 years, time hadn't changed anything. If anything, as Daniel's company grew more successful, his parents' certainty that I was nothing but a gold-digging opportunist who had latched onto their brilliant son only seemed to strengthen. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had secrets of my own. Secrets about Monarch Systems. Secrets about its true origins. Secrets that would shatter the narrative they had so carefully constructed about their golden boy and the woman who wasn't good enough for him. And soon, very soon, those secrets would come to light. They think he built his company from scratch. What they don't know is that it started in our one-bedroom apartment, with my savings, my laptop, and my sleepless nights. It was 6 years ago. I remember the day vividly. Daniel came home, tie loosened, eyes red-rimmed. He'd been laid off from Vertex Technologies during a massive restructuring. The company that had promised him a brilliant future had discarded him like yesterday's newspaper. 27 years old and suddenly unemployed in a competitive tech market. I found him sitting on our second-hand couch, staring at his severance letter. The apartment we rented was modest, 860 square feet with a kitchenette barely big enough for one person to turn around in. Nothing like the pristine mansion he'd grown up in. "They didn't even let me clean out my desk," he said, voice hollow. "Security escorted me out like I was a criminal." I sat beside him, took his hand. We'd been married just 8 months. "What am I going to tell my parents?" He looked genuinely terrified. "Dad's been bragging to everyone about my position. Mom's been telling her friends I'm on the fast track to becoming CTO." The Millers had always measured success in titles and tax brackets. In their world, unemployment wasn't just unfortunate, it was shameful. "Don't tell them yet," I suggested. "Take some time to figure out your next step." That night, over cheap takeout and cheaper wine, Daniel revealed a dream he'd been nurturing silently for years. "I've always wanted to develop my own integrated security platform," he confessed. "Something that combines physical entry systems with cloud-based monitoring. The big companies are all doing one or the other, but nobody's cracked the integration part." His eyes lit up as he described his vision. I'd seen glimpses of his passion before, but never so raw and unfiltered. As a senior marketing strategist at Blackwell Communications, I recognized something marketable in his enthusiasm. "So do it," I said simply. He laughed. "Right. With what capital?" My parents would insist on investing, but then they'd own me even more than they already do. I walked to our bedroom closet and returned with my laptop. "Let's run some numbers." By midnight, fueled by inspiration and the desperate energy that comes from having nothing to lose, we had the skeleton of a business plan. By 3 a.m., I had built a rough website on my laptop, using templates I'd created for other clients. "I have $42,000 in savings," I told him. "We could use that as seed money." Daniel stared at me. "Andrea, that's your house fund. You've been saving for years." The house fund was my private dream, a down payment on something permanent, something ours. Something that would finally make me feel secure after growing up in a household where eviction notices were as common as birthday cards. "I believe in you more than I believe in real estate," I said. And I meant it. The next morning, I called in sick to work. Together, we registered the business, Monarch Systems, named after the butterflies that symbolized transformation. I handled the paperwork while Daniel sketched out the technical architecture. For the next 3 months, our tiny apartment transformed into a startup headquarters. Daniel coded during the day while I worked my regular job. Evenings and weekends, I built the brand identity, drafted contracts, set up accounting systems, and researched potential clients. I slept 4 hours a night, existing on coffee and determination. My marketing background proved invaluable. I could speak the language of the corporate clients Daniel wanted to attract. I knew how to position his technology as a solution rather than just a product. I crafted presentations that he could deliver with confidence. Our first client meeting was held in a coffee shop because we couldn't afford to rent office space. I'd coached Daniel on his pitch the night before, watching him practice until his delivery was flawless. Under the table, my hand squeezed his knee when he started speaking too quickly. The client, a mid-sized property management company, signed on for a pilot program that same day. When I got home, I transferred the last $15,000 from my personal savings to our business account to fund the equipment we'd need. As word spread about Monarch's innovative approach, more clients followed. Daniel's parents assumed he'd quickly landed a new job. We didn't correct them, not because we were being deliberately deceptive, but because Daniel wasn't ready to face their judgment if we failed. 6 months in, we were profitable enough that I could reduce my hours at Blackwell to part-time. The company became our child, our passion, our shared purpose. We celebrated small victories with takeout dinners, high-fived over new contracts, and problem-solved until dawn when challenges arose. Then came the breakthrough. Westridge Commercial Properties, one of the largest real estate developers in the region, wanted to implement our system across their entire portfolio. The contract was worth enough that we could finally rent a proper office, hire staff, and pay ourselves actual salaries. The night after signing the Westridge deal, Daniel called his parents. "I've got some news," he said, voice shaking with excitement. "I've started my own company, Monarch Systems. We just landed a major client." The reaction was immediate. I could hear Richard's booming congratulations through the phone. Margaret's voice chimed in, asking dozens of questions. Daniel beamed with pride as he described the business, but something subtle shifted in his language. "I developed this integrated security platform. I landed this contract. I'm planning to expand." The we had become so gradually, I barely noticed it happening. As Monarch grew, so did Daniel's confidence. He began attending networking events solo, building relationships with investors and clients. His parents started telling their friends about their son, the entrepreneur. They hosted dinner parties to introduce him to their influential connections. These were always business dinners, of course, no place for a spouse. Somewhere along the way, the narrative changed. Daniel became the sole visionary, the risk-taker who built something from nothing. My contributions, financial, strategic, practical, faded into the background like stage machinery behind a star performer. And I let it happen because I loved him and because I took pride in his success. But sometimes, in quiet moments, I remembered those nights in our tiny apartment, both of us hunched over my laptop, building a dream that was supposed to be ours. You'd think after all these years they'd warm up to me. Instead, I heard my mother-in-law call me a parasite on speakerphone. She didn't know I was in the car. It happened on a crisp autumn day, 3 years after Monarch Systems had moved into sleek downtown offices. Daniel was driving us home from a rare weekend getaway, our first in months. The dashboard lit up with his mother's call. Daniel hit the speaker button without thinking. "Hello, Mother," he said, eyes on the road. "Daniel, darling. How was your trip?" Margaret's voice filled the car. I gazed out the window, mentally preparing for the usual pleasantries. "It was great, actually. Andrea and I." "Listen, sweetheart," she interrupted. "I'm calling about the family dinner Thursday night. Your father has invited the Prestons. You remember Gerald Preston? He's now the chairman at First National. This could be huge for Monarch." Daniel frowned. "Thursday? But that's Andrea's birthday. I told you we had plans." There was a pause, then a sigh so theatrical it deserved its own curtain call. "Daniel, this is business. This is your future. The Prestons won't be in town again for months." Her voice dropped to what she probably thought was a whisper. "Besides, Richard, and I think Andrea has been clinging to you too much lately. How many of your client meetings has she attended this quarter?" 3, 4. I froze, my body suddenly cold despite the car's heating. She's your wife, yes, but Monarch is your company. Your achievement. You need to stand on your own. Richard says she's becoming a parasite on your success. Daniel's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. Mother, that's completely. Just come alone, Daniel. We need to present the right image to the Prestons. Andrea contributes nothing to these discussions anyway. The silence that followed her words was absolute. Daniel scrambled to end the call, but the damage was done. He pulled the car over, turning to me with horror in his eyes. Andrea, I'm so sorry. She had no right to. Parasite. I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. Is that what they really think of me? They don't know you, he insisted. They don't understand what we built together. But that was the problem. They didn't know because he had never told them. And over time, he had started believing the story himself. The birthday dinner was canceled, of course. Daniel went to his parents' networking event while I spent the evening alone in our apartment, scrolling through old photos of those early days, the cramped apartment, our makeshift office, the celebration after our first big contract. Proof of a partnership that seemed to be fading with each passing day. After that incident, things only got worse. The Millers' campaign against me became more overt, as if that phone call had given them permission to stop pretending. The following month, they hosted their annual anniversary celebration, a tradition spanning 3 decades. The invitation arrived by courier, addressed only to Daniel. When he called to clarify, Richard didn't even try to be subtle. It's a family tradition, son. Margaret, and I thought it would be nice to have just family this year. After 5 years of marriage, I was still not family. Daniel attended, reluctantly. He came home subdued, avoiding my questions about the evening. It wasn't until weeks later that our friend Taylor, who was dating Daniel's cousin, revealed the truth. They spent half the night talking about how lucky you are to have Daniel. Taylor told me over coffee, her expression uncomfortable. Margaret kept saying how you cling to his success like it's your own. I nodded, unsurprised but still wounded. What did Daniel do? Taylor looked away. He just sat there. He changed the subject once or twice, but he didn't defend me. He didn't set the record straight. The final straw came at Christmas. The Millers hosted their annual holiday party, and this time I was invited, presumably because excluding the spouse of their only son at Christmas would raise too many eyebrows among their social circle. I wore a red dress I'd saved for months to buy, determined to hold my head high. Daniel and I arrived fashionably late, and I plastered on my most convincing smile as Margaret air-kissed my cheeks. Andrea, how lovely. That dress is certainly bold. The evening progressed predictably. I was seated at the far end of the table, away from Daniel, who was positioned between his father and Gerald Preston, the banking executive from the infamous birthday dinner call. After dinner, the men retreated to Richard's study for brandy. The women gathered in the sitting room, where Margaret presided like a queen holding court. I sat quietly, nursing a glass of wine that didn't quite dull the pain of isolation. Daniel's newest security patent is absolutely revolutionary, Margaret announced to her friends. Richard says it could triple the company's value. Her friend Vivian nodded approvingly. You must be so proud, Margaret. Daniel has achieved so much on his own. Well, he comes from good stock, Margaret preened. Richard always said entrepreneurship is in the Miller blood. I couldn't help myself. The patent was actually a joint effort. The initial concept came from... Oh, Andrea, Margaret interrupted with a laugh that made my skin crawl. You're such a supportive wife, always trying to understand Daniel's work. But let's be honest, dear, we all know where the brains in your marriage reside. The room filled with tittering laughter. I felt my face burn, not with embarrassment, but with rage. That patent had been my idea, born during a weekend hike when I suggested combining 2 existing technologies to solve a persistent client complaint. When we returned home that night, I was silent. Daniel mistook my quiet for sadness, rather than the cold fury it truly was. They don't mean it, he said, loosening his tie. Mother just gets carried away with pride. When are you going to tell them the truth, Daniel? About Monarch? About us? He looked genuinely confused. What do you mean? In that moment, I realized something devastating. He had begun to believe the myth himself. In his mind, he had become the sole genius behind Monarch's success. My contributions had been reduced to supportive wife duties in his narrative too. That night, I made a decision. I began documenting everything. Every email from the early days, every contract I'd drafted, every presentation I'd created, every financial contribution I'd made. I dug up the original business registration showing both our names. I retrieved bank statements showing the transfers from my personal savings. I wasn't planning revenge. I was preserving the truth before it disappeared completely. And then, 3 weeks later, the opportunity one hadn't known I was waiting for arrived in Daniel's email. Monarch Systems had been nominated for the Regional Entrepreneurial Excellence Award. I didn't need revenge. I needed the truth to speak for itself. Loudly. The Regional Entrepreneurial Excellence Award wasn't just any accolade. It was the most prestigious business recognition in our area, covered by major media outlets and attended by industry titans. Past winners had gone on to national prominence. The nomination alone put Monarch Systems in elite company. Daniel was ecstatic when he received the email. He burst into our kitchen that evening, tablet in hand, practically bouncing with excitement. We're finalists for the RE Award, he announced, his eyes bright with a joy I hadn't seen in months. Can you believe it? Monarch Systems, nominated in the Innovation Leadership category. For a brief, beautiful moment, he had said we. I savored it, knowing how quickly it would vanish. That's incredible, I said, genuinely happy for the recognition of what we had built, even if half the story remained untold. Daniel scrolled through the email, reading requirements aloud. They need company history, financial growth statements, client testimonials. Oh, and a formal statement of founding, including original investors and ownership documentation. He looked up, a flicker of something, awareness? Guilt, crossing his face before he quickly moved on. Mother and father will be over the moon. Dad's been saying Monarch deserves recognition like this for years. Of course he had. In Richard Miller's version of events, his son was a self-made wunderkind who had conjured a multi-million-dollar company through sheer brilliance and Miller family grit. The gala's in 6 weeks, Daniel continued. Black tie, full media coverage. You'll need something spectacular to wear. At least I was invited to this one, I thought wryly. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, I opened my laptop and accessed my private cloud storage, the digital archive I'd been building since Christmas. Every founding document, every early email, every bank transfer that proved my financial investment. I'd been collecting them meticulously, not knowing when or how they might be needed. The time had come. The next morning, I called Lydia Chen, Monarch's head of PR, whom I'd personally hired 3 years earlier. Lydia, I'm putting together the submission package for the RE Awards, I said casually. Can you send me the company narrative we used for that Tech Forward feature last year? Of course, Mrs. Miller. Should I copy Mr. Miller as well? No need to bother him. He's swamped with the Westridge expansion. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. I didn't need to fabricate anything or engage in dramatic confrontations. I just needed to submit the complete, unabridged truth. Over the next week, I compiled the award submission, working late after Daniel had gone to bed. I included everything the committee requested: company history, financial growth, client testimonials. But unlike previous PR materials, this submission contained the full story. I attached the original business registration with both our names clearly listed as co-founders. I included bank statements showing the transfer of my savings, the seed money that had given Monarch its start. I added screenshots of early client presentations I had created, email threads showing my negotiations with our first major clients, and documentation of the initial business plan in my handwriting. For the required founder biography, I wrote, Monarch Systems was founded in 2018 by Daniel and Andrea Miller, who combined Daniel's technical expertise with Andrea's marketing and business development background to create an integrated security solution. Starting with Andrea's personal savings of $42,000 as seed capital, the company was initially operated from their one-bedroom apartment. just the facts. Nothing embellished, nothing exaggerated. When I finished the submission, I saved it and sent it directly to the awards committee from my Monarch Systems email address, the same one that appeared on hundreds of client communications over the years. Then I waited. 3 days later, the confirmation arrived. Thank you for your complete submission to the Regional Entrepreneurial Excellence Awards. Your materials have been received and will be reviewed by our judging panel. That evening, Daniel mentioned that the awards committee had acknowledged receipt of Monarch's submission. They said everything looked comprehensive, he noted, sounding slightly puzzled. Did you help with that? I was planning to work on it this weekend. I handled it, I said simply. It seemed important. He looked relieved. Thank you. One less thing to worry about with the Westridge expansion looming. He kissed my cheek and returned to his laptop, unaware of what had been set in motion. The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparations. The Millers, predictably, treated the nomination as further evidence of their son's exceptional nature. Margaret called daily with suggestions about the gala, who Daniel should network with, what he should emphasize in his potential acceptance speech, which influential figures might be in attendance. The Harringtons will be at our table, she informed him during one such call. Robert Harrington sits on 3 major corporate boards. This could be transformative for you, Daniel. I noticed she never said for you and Andrea, or for Monarch. In her mind, her son and his company were one entity, and I was still an irrelevant appendage. 1 week before the gala, I was reviewing the event program that had been emailed to nominees when my heart nearly stopped. There, listed under Monarch Systems, were 2 names, Daniel Miller and Andrea Miller, co-founders. The truth was already making its way into the world. That same day, Daniel received a call from the awards committee requesting additional information about Monarch's early funding. I was in the kitchen when he took the call, and I watched his face change as he struggled to answer their specific questions about the initial capital investment. After hanging up, he sat at our dining table, staring at nothing. They asked about the seed money, he said. About the business registration. They had very specific questions. I set a cup of coffee in front of him. What did you tell them? The truth, he said quietly. That it was your savings that started everything. That you were there from day one. He looked up at me, something shifting in his eyes. I've never actually denied that, have I? He hadn't explicitly denied it, no. He had simply allowed it to be forgotten, by his parents, by our social circle, eventually even by himself. The program lists you as co-founder, he continued. That's accurate, isn't it? That's what the original papers say. I nodded. That's what the original papers say. For the first time in years, Daniel seemed to be seeing clearly, not just the company we had built, but the narrative he had allowed to form around it. The myth of the solo genius that had so conveniently aligned with his parents' vision of their exceptional son. I've been an ass, haven't I? He finally said. It wasn't a full reckoning, but it was a start. And with the gala just days away, it was about to become much more. When the announcer said, "Please welcome the co-founder of Monarch Systems," my in-laws turned in their seats. They weren't ready. The gala was everything the Millers had hoped for: crystal chandeliers, elite attendees in formal wear, perfectly orchestrated for networking. Richard and Margaret arrived early, positioning themselves strategically among their social circle. Margaret wore midnight blue silk, every inch the matriarch of a business dynasty. Daniel had gone to his parents for pre-event photos, just family, Margaret had specified. I arrived separately in a gown of monarch butterfly orange, bold and impossible to ignore. The Millers had secured a prime table near the stage. As I approached, Margaret's gaze lingered on my dress, disapproval evident in her tight smile. Andrea, she acknowledged coolly. We were just discussing Daniel's speech. If Monarch wins, the exposure will be extraordinary. When Monarch wins, Richard corrected, clapping his son's shoulder. Our boy's going to knock it out of the park. Throughout dinner, I barely touched my food. Daniel seemed unusually quiet, watching me with a peculiar intensity when he thought I wasn't looking. Something had shifted between us since the call from the awards committee. Not quite reconciliation, but a crack in the narrative we'd both allowed to solidify. When the Innovation Leadership Award presentation began, Margaret reached across to squeeze Daniel's hand. "This is it, darling. Your moment." The MC smiled at the audience. "Before announcing the winner, we have a special presentation about each finalist." The lights dimmed. After showcasing 2 other companies, Monarch's feature began. Founded in 2018, Monarch Systems revolutionized integrated security platforms, narrated a smooth voice. But like many success stories, it began with risk, vision, and partnership. The screen displayed our original business plan, my handwriting visible in the margins, starting with $42,000 in personal savings. I heard Margaret's sharp intake of breath. Co-founders Daniel and Andrea Miller built the company from their apartment. The video cut to early footage of Daniel and me in our makeshift home office, footage I'd recorded on my phone during those first months. There I was, explaining our marketing strategy while Daniel nodded beside me. While Daniel Miller developed the core technology, Andrea Miller crafted the business strategy, secured initial funding, and acquired the company's first major clients. On screen appeared the Westridge contract with my signature, followed by email screenshots showing my negotiations with early clients. Together, they built what experts now call the most innovative security platform of the decade. As the lights rose, a profound silence fell over our table. Margaret's face had gone rigid. Richard frowned deeply, eyes darting between Daniel and me. Elise looked like she'd swallowed something unpleasant. Daniel, however, was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, part surprise, part guilt, and something that looked almost like pride. And the winner is Monarch Systems. Daniel stood, extending his hand to me. Together, we walked toward the stage, his hand at the small of my back, a gesture of unity we hadn't shared in public for years. Please welcome the co-founders of Monarch Systems, Daniel and Andrea Miller. The spotlight found us, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was standing in Daniel's shadow. Daniel accepted the Crystal Award and stepped to the microphone. The Millers leaned forward, eager to hear their son's triumph. "Thank you for this honor," Daniel began. "When Andrea and I started Monarch Systems, we had nothing but an idea and her savings account." I watched Margaret's smile freeze. "I've been fortunate to receive recognition for Monarch's success," he continued, "but tonight, I want to set the record straight. This company exists because my wife believed in me when no one else did, not even myself." He turned to me, his eyes reflecting a truth I'd thought he'd forgotten. Andrea didn't just support Monarch Systems. She created it, the brand, the business model, the client relationships. While I was coding, she was building everything else that made those codes matter. Daniel raised the award slightly. "This belongs to both of us. And I'm sorry it's taken me so long to say that publicly." The audience applauded, oblivious to the seismic shift occurring at the Miller family table. I stepped to the microphone. "Thank you," I said simply. Monarch Systems has always been about integration, bringing different systems together to create something stronger than its individual parts. That philosophy extends to our founding partnership. I looked directly at the Miller table. Sometimes the most important contributions are the ones that aren't immediately visible, but they're essential all the same. As we returned to our seats, the silence at our table was deafening. Richard looked stunned. Elise couldn't meet my eyes. Margaret was stone-faced, her social mask cracking to reveal the calculations happening behind it. "Why wasn't I told about any of this?" she finally whispered to Daniel, her voice tight with controlled fury. "You never asked," he replied quietly but firmly. "You assumed. You all did." For the first time since I'd married into the Miller family, I felt the power dynamic shift. I wasn't just Daniel's wife anymore, not just the gold digger who'd snagged the golden boy. I was Andrea Miller, co-founder of Monarch Systems, a woman whose business acumen and personal investment had helped build the very success they'd been attributing solely to their son. As dessert was served, I caught Daniel watching me. He reached under the table and took my hand, squeezing it gently. It wasn't an apology, not fully, but it was an acknowledgement. A beginning. And from the looks on his parents' faces, it was also the end of a narrative they had crafted so carefully around their son and the woman they deemed unworthy of him. They didn't say a word that night, but it was the first time they looked at me and didn't see a gold digger. They saw the architect of their golden boy's empire. The ride home from the gala was quiet. Daniel loosened his bow tie, staring out the window at the passing city lights. The Crystal Award sat between us, catching the occasional flash of street lamps. "I should have done that years ago," he finally said, his voice soft but clear in the hushed car interior. I didn't respond immediately. Part of me wanted to say, "Yes, you should have." Another part recognized that this moment, this shift, was fragile, and I didn't want to burden it with accusations. "At least you did it tonight," I said instead.
He reached for my hand.
"I'm sorry, Andrea. Not just for tonight, but for everything. For letting them treat you that way. For starting to believe it myself." When we arrived home, neither of us slept. We sat on our balcony until dawn, talking more honestly than we had in years. About Monarch's beginnings. About how gradually, imperceptibly, my contributions had been erased from the narrative. "I didn't set out to take credit for your work," Daniel said, rubbing his tired eyes. "It just became easier to accept their version. To be the son they always wanted me to be. And I let it happen," I admitted. "I stepped back bit by bit because it seemed to make everyone happy." "Everyone except you." I nodded. "Everyone except me." The Millers didn't contact us for 3 days after the gala. No calls, no texts, just silence. It was Richard who finally broke the ice, inviting Daniel to lunch. Alone, of course. Daniel declined. "I think we need a family meeting," he told his father. "All of us." That Saturday, we met at a private dining room in an upscale restaurant downtown, neutral territory. Margaret and Richard arrived precisely on time, both looking like they'd rehearsed their expressions of polite neutrality. The awkwardness was palpable as we ordered drinks. Small talk about the weather, about Daniel's sister's new kitchen renovation, anything to avoid the elephant in the room. Finally, after our first course arrived, Richard cleared his throat. "Andrea," he began stiffly, "it seems we owe you an apology." Margaret nodded, her lips pressed into a tight line. "We had no idea of your involvement in Monarch's founding." It wasn't exactly a warm acknowledgement, but from the Millers, it was revolutionary. "You could have asked," I pointed out quietly, "at any point in the last 6 years." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "We made assumptions that were incorrect. You treated my wife like she was nothing but a gold digger," Daniel said bluntly. "You excluded her from family events. You insulted her to her face and behind her back." Margaret flushed. "Daniel, that's hardly." "It's exactly fair," he interrupted, "and I let it happen. That stops today." The rest of the lunch proceeded with tense civility. The Millers made strained efforts to ask about my role at Monarch, though I could tell they were struggling to reconcile the woman they dismissed for years with the business strategist revealed in the awards video. As we prepared to leave, Margaret pulled me aside. "I want you to know," she said with obvious difficulty, "that I respect what you've built with Daniel. I should have seen it sooner." It wasn't quite an apology, but from Margaret Miller it was seismic. The weeks following the gala brought more changes. The award had generated significant media coverage, and several business publications requested interviews with both founders. For the first time, I found myself sitting beside Daniel in press features, telling my part of the Monarch story. The Business Journal ran a profile titled "The Hidden Architect: Andrea Miller's Crucial Role in Monarch Systems' Rise." My phone began ringing with invitations to speak at women's business forums and entrepreneurship panels. Daniel watched these developments with a mixture of pride and lingering guilt. "You deserve this recognition," he told me one evening as we reviewed an offer for a joint keynote address. All of it. At Monarch itself, my position evolved. I'd been working as the company's marketing director, an important role, but one that minimized my founding contribution. Now, with the truth public, we restructured the leadership team. My new business card read Andrea Miller, co-founder and chief strategy officer. The first board meeting after my promotion included a surprise visitor, Richard Miller. He'd remained an occasional advisor to Monarch, appearing at quarterly reviews to offer his banking expertise. Usually, he spoke only to Daniel. This time, he sought me out afterward. That analysis of the Eastbrook acquisition was impressive, he said, referring to a presentation I'd given. Very thorough risk assessment. Coming from Richard, it was practically effusive praise. The most meaningful change, though, was in my marriage. Daniel and I began rebuilding what had been slowly eroding, the partnership that had launched Monarch in the first place. We reinstated our Friday strategy sessions, brainstorming over takeout like we had in our one-bedroom apartment years ago. He started bringing technical problems to me again, valuing my outsider perspective. 3 months after the gala, the Millers hosted their annual summer barbecue. In previous years, I'd been an afterthought at these gatherings, relegated to polite conversation with distant relatives while Daniel was showcased to their social circle. This time, Margaret sent the invitation addressed to both of us. When we arrived, she greeted me with an embrace that, while not warm, was no longer merely performative. Andrea, Gerald Preston was just asking about Monarch's expansion plans, she said, leading me toward a group that included several business associates. I told him you were the one to speak with. Later that evening, I overheard Richard talking to a colleague. My son and his wife built that company together, he was saying. Andrea had the business mind to complement Daniel's technical vision. They still saw me through the lens of their son, as Daniel's complement rather than as my own person. But it was progress. That night, as Daniel and I drove home, I realized I no longer felt the burning need to prove myself to the Millers. The truth had been revealed, not through confrontation, but through its own undeniable weight. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked, noticing my silence. I smiled. That the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's standing in your truth and letting it speak for itself.
He reached for my hand.
I'm sorry it took me so long to stand beside you in that truth. You're here now, I said, squeezing his fingers. That's what matters. The Crystal Award sat on our mantel, catching the morning light. A reminder not of victory over the Millers, but of reclaiming the narrative we had written together. A partnership renewed, a truth restored, and a future where I was no longer just the wife, but a founder in my own right. The silence of that gala night had indeed said everything. But the conversations that followed said even more.